In downtown Los Angeles, a weary homeless veteran was about to face humiliation at the hands of authority. A quiet meal on the corner of 7th and Main turned deadly when an arrogant young cop decided to make an example of him in front of a restless crowd. James Connor wasn't your typical drifter. For 12 years, he was a Marine in the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, known for surviving brutal campaigns and earning a Bronze Star and Purple Heart. When Officer Derek Mills mocked his service, scattered his belongings, and struck him down, he had no idea a silent witness was already rising from the crowd. Chuck Norris, veteran, martial artist, and living legend, stepped in with calm precision, his intervention sparking a chain of events that would ripple through the city and the department alike. What began as one officer's abuse of power would become a public reckoning. The streets of Los Angeles would never be the same after a homeless veteran and an unexpected guardian showed the city the difference between authority and respect. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The city blazed with light against the night sky, a constellation of neon and street lamps stretching between glass towers. Downtown pulsed with Friday night energy couples laughing outside restaurants, college students drifting between bars, street musicians competing with traffic noise. Food carts lined the busy intersection of 7th and Main, their savory aromas cutting through exhaust fumes and perfume. Vendors called out to passers-by, voices rising and falling in the urban symphony. At the corner, Miguel's taco stand was doing steady business. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, slicing meat, sprinkling cilantro, squeezing lime wedges. Though surrounded by chaos, his movements remained unhurried, deliberate. A man approached, not a customer, but a familiar presence. He moved with subtle military precision despite his ragged appearance. Back straight, shoulders squared, even as his clothes hung loose on his frame. "Evening, James," Miguel said warmly, already preparing a foil-wrapped package. James nodded, his weathered face creasing slightly. "Evening." Just one word, but delivered with quiet dignity. Miguel pressed the warm parcel into James's calloused hands. "Extra salsa tonight," he said, the way one might announce a gift. "Cold front coming through. Something hot helps." James accepted with a slight nod that spoke volumes. Their exchange required few words. They'd developed a language of small gestures over months. To casual observers, James was just another homeless man, invisible among the downtown crowd. But Miguel knew better. The faded military tattoo on James's forearm, the way he said, "Sir," and "Ma'am," to everyone. The 1,000-yard stare that sometimes overtook him when sirens wailed too close. "Thank you," James said, reaching into his pocket for the few coins he had. Miguel waved them away. "On the house. Just like yesterday." He lowered his voice. "And tomorrow." James didn't argue. Pride could be put aside when necessary. He'd learned that lesson after 3 tours overseas. Instead, he offered something more valuable than money: respect. He straightened, shoulders back, and gave Miguel a subtle nod that carried the weight of his military past. Not far from the taco stand, a cafe table sat occupied by a solitary figure. Most wouldn't have noticed him. He seemed to prefer it that way. Chuck Norris sat quietly observing the street, nursing a black coffee. His presence was understated yet unmistakable to anyone paying attention. The weathered face, the watchful eyes, the perfect stillness amid urban chaos. He wore a simple dark jacket, jeans, and boots, nothing flashy, nothing calling for attention. Years of discipline had taught him to blend in when needed, to become part of the background until action was required. His gaze drifted to James. Recognition flickered in Chuck's eyes, not of the man personally, but of what he represented. The bearing. The haunted focus. The discipline that survived whatever battles had left their marks. Chuck had seen that look before. In friends who'd served. In men who carried wars within them long after returning home. The night flowed around them all, Chuck watching, James eating his meal with methodical precision, Miguel serving other customers. Nearby, a group of college students laughed too loudly outside a sports bar, spilling drinks and stories onto the sidewalk. A couple argued in hushed tones by a parking meter. Two businessmen hurried toward a late meeting. Normal urban tapestry. Threads crossing without entanglement. Until the police cruiser rolled to a stop at the curb. Officer Derek Mills emerged like he owned the street. Young, fit, with a swagger that demanded attention. His uniform was pristine, badge gleaming under streetlights, belt heavy with equipment that jingled faintly as he moved. Derek had been on the force just 18 months, but carried himself with the confidence of someone with far more experience. "Keep it moving, folks," he called to a group of teenagers lingering near a storefront. His voice carried unnecessarily loud, designed to draw eyes. No loitering. The teens muttered, but dispersed. Derek watched them go with a satisfied smirk, then scanned the street for his next target. His gaze settled on James. At the cafe table, Chuck Norris set his coffee down slowly. Something in the officer's posture caught his attention. The subtle coiling of someone looking for confrontation. Chuck had seen it countless times, in dojos, in competition, in bars where young men wanted to prove themselves. He didn't move, but his awareness sharpened. Officer Mills strolled toward James, hand resting casually on his baton. "Evening," he said, voice carrying to nearby pedestrians. Several people slowed, sensing the theatrical edge in his tone. "Enjoying our sidewalk accommodations?" James looked up calmly. "Good evening, officer." His voice was steady, neither confrontational nor submissive. He folded the foil wrapper carefully and placed it in a nearby trash can. "ID," Derek said, extending his hand. James reached slowly into his jacket, movements deliberate to avoid misinterpretation. He produced a worn VA identification card and handed it over. Derek glanced at it dismissively. "James Connor," he read aloud. "Fancy yourself a soldier, huh?" He handed the card back with 2 fingers, as if reluctant to touch it. "Marine Corps. 12 years." James answered simply. No embellishment, no challenge. "Well, Marine," Derek emphasized the word with subtle mockery. "You know the rules about camping in the business district." He gestured vaguely at James's weathered backpack resting against the wall. "Not camping, sir. Just having a meal." James's voice remained even, eyes forward. Miguel stepped from behind his cart. "He's a customer," he offered. "Paid for his food like anyone else." The lie about payment came easily. A small shield of dignity. Officer Mills turned his attention to Miguel. "Health department know you're serving the homeless population, amigo?" The last word dripped with insinuation. Miguel's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "I serve anyone hungry, officer." The crowd around them had grown, drawn by the rising tension. Some watched with uncomfortable fascination. Others pretended not to notice while stealing glances. A few openly recorded with their phones. The gathering audience seemed to energize Officer Mills. He straightened, voice projecting further. "Public safety concern," he announced, as if addressing the onlookers rather than James. "We've had complaints about aggressive panhandling." "I haven't asked anyone for anything," James said, still seated. "Stand up when I'm talking to you." Derek's voice hardened. James complied smoothly, the military discipline evident in his movement. Even with stooped shoulders and worn clothes, he carried himself with quiet dignity. He stood a few inches taller than the officer, a fact that seemed to irritate Derek further. "Think you're intimidating me?" Derek stepped closer, invading James's space. "No, sir." James kept his hands visible, his posture non-threatening. Chuck Norris set his empty cup down, eyes never leaving the escalating scene. His expression remained neutral, but something hardened in his gaze. Around him, cafe patrons whispered, a few pointing their phones toward the confrontation. Officer Mills circled James like a predator, playing to his growing audience. "You know, we get calls about you people all the time. Scaring away, paying customers, making the area look bad." He gestured to James's worn clothing. "Making the whole neighborhood smell bad, too." A few uncomfortable laughs rippled through the crowd. Others exchanged uneasy glances. James remained silent, eyes forward. "Nothing to say for yourself?" Derek pressed, stepping closer. "Cat got your tongue, soldier?" "Nothing to say, sir," James replied evenly. The officer's face flushed slightly. He'd expected fear, anger, something he could escalate against. James's calm seemed to frustrate him more than defiance would have. "Empty your pockets!" Derek demanded, loud enough for everyone to hear. James began to comply, methodically removing the few possessions he carried. Some coins, a folded photo, yellowed with age, a worn lighter, his VA card. Derek picked up the photo with the tip of his pen. It showed a younger James in uniform, standing beside a woman and small child. "Family abandon you? Or did you abandon them?" he asked. Voice casual, but cruel. Something flickered across James's face, the first crack in his composure. His fingers twitched slightly, but he kept his hands open, visible. Miguel stepped forward again. "That's enough, officer. He's not causing any trouble." "Step back," Derek snapped. "Unless you want me checking your permit situation." Chuck Norris stood. The movement was unhurried, yet somehow drew attention, despite its quietness. Several heads turned, conversation pausing as recognition dawned on nearby faces. Chuck didn't speak or approach. He simply stood, watching, his presence suddenly impossible to ignore. Officer Mills, focused on James, hadn't noticed. He prodded James's backpack with his boot. "What's in here? Drugs? Booze?" "Just my things, sir." James's voice remained steady, though tension had crept into his shoulders. "We'll see about that." Derek unzipped the backpack roughly, upending it onto the sidewalk. A thin sleeping roll, a change of clothes, a dog-eared paperback, and a small metal box tumbled out. Derek kicked at the items casually, spreading them across the dirty concrete. The metal box popped open. Inside lay military medals, a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, campaign ribbons from Iraq and Afghanistan. A murmur ran through the watching crowd. Someone whispered, "Holy shit, he's for real." Derek hesitated, just a fraction, then doubled down. "Nice props," he said, though his conviction wavered. "You buy these online, or at a surplus store?" James finally reacted, kneeling to gather his medals. "They're mine," he said, voice still controlled but tighter. "Earned them." "Sure you did." Derek placed his boot over the Bronze Star. "I'm gonna need you to move along now. This isn't a shelter." James looked up, meeting the officer's eyes directly for the first time. "I'll go, sir. Just need my property." "Are you giving me orders?" Derek leaned down, voice dropping dangerously. The crowd had grown larger. Phones recorded from every angle. The tension had become palpable, a wire pulled too tight. In the cafe area, Chuck Norris watched with unblinking focus. He hadn't moved since standing, hadn't spoken, hadn't drawn attention to himself. But something had changed in his posture, a subtle shift from observation to readiness. The night air crackled with the promise of something about to break. Officer Derek Mills stood over James, boots still planted firmly on the Bronze Star medal. His hand rested on his belt, fingers drumming near his baton. The crowd had formed a loose semicircle around them, spectators to the unfolding drama. Some filmed openly, phones held high. Others watched with uncomfortable fascination, caught between voyeurism and concern. "I asked if you were giving me orders," Derek repeated, leaning further into James's space. His voice carried theatrical menace, designed to be overheard. James remained kneeling, eyes on his scattered possessions. "No, sir. Just requesting my property." "Requesting?" Derek mimicked, drawing a few nervous laughs from the crowd. "Very official. Very military." He ground his heel slightly, pushing the metal against the concrete. Something tightened in James's jaw, a nearly imperceptible flex of muscle, but his hands remained open at his sides, not clenched, not threatening, just waiting with the patient endurance of a man accustomed to weathering storms. Miguel stepped forward again, plastic spatula still in hand. "Officer? Please? He's done nothing wrong." Derek's head snapped toward him. "Stay out of this, unless you want trouble." His hand patted his duty belt meaningfully. "I'm handling a situation here." From his position near the cafe, Chuck Norris watched with absolute focus. He hadn't moved since rising from his seat, hadn't called attention to himself, but those closest to him had fallen silent. Sensing something in his stillness, the coiled readiness of a man who understood precisely what he was witnessing. "Stand up," Derek ordered James. "Now." James rose smoothly, military bearing evident despite his worn clothing. He stood at parade, rest feet, shoulder width apart, hands clasped behind his back. Not threatening, not submissive, just disciplined. The officer circled him again, playing to his audience. "You know what I see here?" he asked loudly. "I see a guy who couldn't cut it. Couldn't handle civilian life." He gestured theatrically at James's appearance. "So, now, what expect special treatment because you wore a uniform once?" A ripple went through the crowd, discomfort from some, ugly encouragement from others. Someone called out, "Leave him alone, man." But the voice was quickly hushed by those eager for escalation. "Nothing to say for yourself?" Derek pressed, stopping directly in front of James. "All that military discipline, and you end up here?" He waved his hand dismissively at the sidewalk, the scattered possessions. James met his gaze evenly. "Everyone has their battles, sir." "Sir," Derek repeated with a sneer. "I'm not your commanding officer. I'm the guy telling you to get moving before I run you in for vagrancy." "Just need my things first," James said quietly. "Your things." Derek nudged the paperback with his boot. "This trash?" "My property," James corrected, a hint of firmness entering his voice. Derek's expression hardened. He stepped closer, using his authority like a weapon. "You giving me attitude now, soldier boy?" James didn't back away. "No attitude, officer. Just stating facts." The crowd had grown. Office workers leaving late shifts paused to watch. Bar patrons spilled out, drinks in hand. The street corner had become an impromptu theater, with Derek center stage and James his unwilling co-star. "Facts," Derek said, drawing out the word. "Here's a fact. I decide who stays and who goes on my beat." He pressed a finger against James's chest. "And you're going." James looked down at the finger, then back up at Derek's face. He didn't speak. But something in his gaze, steady, unintimidated, seemed to further agitate the officer. Derek shoved him. Not hard enough to knock him down, but enough to force him back a step. "You deaf?" I said, "Move." James regained his balance easily. "My possessions, sir." "Then I'll go." "Your possessions?" Derek mocked. He bent down and picked up the photo of James's family. "This what you care about? This why you're giving me trouble?" He held it up to the light, examining it with exaggerated interest. "Pretty lady. She leave you when you came back all messed up in the head?" James's composure flickered. A muscle jumped in his jaw. "Hit a nerve, did I?" Derek grinned, sensing weakness. "What happened to them?" "They realize what a loser you turned out to be. They died," James said quietly. "Car accident. While I was deployed." A hush fell over the immediate crowd. Even those hungry for conflict seemed momentarily sobered. Derek hesitated, then doubled down. "Convenient story." He let the photo drop to the ground. "Pick up your shit and get out of my sight." James knelt again, reaching for the photo first. As he did, Derek's boot came down on his outstretched hand, not crushing, but pinning it against the concrete. "I don't think I dismissed you yet," Derek said. Voice low, but carrying. Pain flashed across James's face, quickly controlled. He didn't pull away. "Please. Remove your boot, officer," he said. Each word precise. "Or what?" Derek leaned slightly more weight onto his foot. "You'll do what exactly?" The crowd's mood shifted. Some called out protests. Others filmed more intently. A few looked away, uncomfortable with their own complicity as spectators. Chuck Norris took one step forward. Just one. His movement was unhurried, almost casual, but it cut through the chaotic energy of the scene like a blade. Heads turned. Whispers spread. Recognition rippled outward, like a stone dropped in still water. "Is that? Holy shit. Chuck Norris?" Derek, caught up in his performance, hadn't noticed. He ground his heel slightly on James's hand. "I asked you a question, soldier. What are you gonna do about it?" James remained perfectly still, eyes locked on Derek's. "Nothing, sir. That's the point." Derek blinked, momentarily thrown off script. "What? The difference between us?" James said quietly. "I was trained when to fight. You weren't trained when not to." Anger flashed across Derek's face. He removed his boot from James's hand, only to deliver a sharp kick to his shoulder that sent the veteran sprawling backward. "That's assaulting an officer," Derek announced loudly, hand moving to his baton. Resisting. The crowd erupted in contradictory shouts. "He didn't do anything! We're all filming this." "That's bullshit, man." James had caught himself with military reflex, already back on one knee. A lesser man might have fought back or fled. He did neither. He simply looked up at Derek with quiet assessment, as if cataloging the officer's actions rather than reacting to them. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Derek unclipped his baton, extending it with a metallic snap that cut through the noise. "On your stomach. Now." His voice carried the dangerous edge of a man who knew he'd gone too far and saw no way back except forward. Miguel had abandoned his food cart entirely, moving to stand near James. "This is wrong," he said. "Everyone can see it." "Back off," Derek snapped. "Unless you want to join him." He gestured with the baton. "Last warning." On the ground. James slowly raised his hands to shoulder height. non-threatening, but not submissive either. "Officer," he said calmly, "you might want to reconsider." "Threatening me now?" Derek's voice rose, playing to the crowd again. "That's it." He swung the baton in a short, vicious arc. James moved with surprising speed, not to attack but to block deflecting the strike with his forearm. The impact made a dull sound that carried across the now silent street corner. Derek's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in fury. He drew back for another swing. The crowd's attention had shifted. Not to James or Derek, but to the figure moving through their midst with unhurried purpose. Chuck Norris walked forward, his steps measured and calm. He didn't rush, didn't shout, didn't call attention to himself. Yet the crowd parted before him like water around the prow of a ship. Conversations dying mid-sentence. Phones turning to capture his approach. Derek, focused on James, hadn't noticed the change in the crowd's energy. He raised the baton higher, prepared to bring it down with greater force. "I wouldn't," came a quiet voice behind him. Derek froze, baton still raised. He turned slowly. Chuck Norris stood just a few feet away, hands relaxed at his sides. His expression was neutral, his posture casual. Yet something about his presence filled the space between them, a tangible sense of controlled power that needed no demonstration. "Step back, civilian," Derek said, but the authority had drained from his voice. Chuck didn't move. His gaze flicked briefly to James, noting the military bearing, the calm in crisis, then back to Derek. "The man asked for his property," he said simply. The crowd had gone completely silent now. Phones recorded from every angle. The street corner had become a stage, and every person present knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. Derek's eyes widened as recognition dawned. "You're," he began. "Just a concerned citizen," Chuck finished for him. "Who thinks you might be overstepping?" Derek swallowed visibly. Baton still raised but now trembling slightly. "This is police business," he said, voice strained for authority. "You need to step back." Chuck's expression didn't change. "So do you," he replied quietly. Those 3 words carried more weight than a shouted command. They hung in the air between them, not a threat but a simple, undeniable truth. Derek glanced around, suddenly aware of the sea of phones recording his every move, the utter silence of the crowd, the growing realization of his position. His options had narrowed to a pinpoint. Chuck remained perfectly still, his gaze steady. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made any threatening moves, yet his presence alone had shifted the entire dynamic of the confrontation. "Your call, officer," Chuck said calmly. "But right now, everyone's watching." The night seemed suspended. In that moment, the officer frozen with baton half raised, Chuck Norris standing unmoving before him, James still kneeling amid his scattered possessions. The crowd held its collective breath, sensing the weight of what was unfolding. Officer Derek Mills lowered his baton slowly, not in surrender but in calculation. His eyes darted between Chuck, the surrounding phones recording his every move, and James. The swagger that had carried him into this confrontation was faltering, but his pride wouldn't let him simply walk away. This man, Derek gestured toward James with forced confidence, was causing a disturbance. "I'm doing my job." Chuck's expression remained unchanged. "Was he?" he asked simply. Just 2 words, but they carried the weight of every recording device pointed their way. Every witness who had seen the truth. Derek's mouth tightened. "You don't have all the facts," he insisted, voice hardening to mask his uncertainty. "I saw enough," Chuck replied, his tone neither argumentative nor aggressive, just matter of fact. James had remained silent, watching the exchange with the careful assessment of a man accustomed to evaluating threats. Now he spoke, his voice steady. "Officer, I'll collect my things and move on. No need for this to escalate further." The reasonableness of the statement seemed to irritate Derek more than defiance would have. It highlighted the unnecessary aggression of his own actions. He turned back to James, seeking to reassert control. "You'll move when I say you can move," he snapped, gesturing with the baton. Chuck took one step closer. Nothing dramatic or threatening, just a single, deliberate step that somehow commanded the entire space. "The man has a right to his property," he said quietly. Derek's eyes flicked to Chuck, then back to James. Sweat had begun to bead along his hairline despite the cool evening air. "Fine," he said tersely. "Get your stuff and clear out. You've got 30 seconds. James began gathering his scattered possessions with dignified efficiency. His movements were hampered by what appeared to be a stiffness in his right shoulder. Not from Derek's kick, but an older injury carried with the stoic endurance of chronic pain. Chuck noticed. His gaze tracked from James's shoulder to the Purple Heart medal still lying on the pavement, making a connection that wasn't lost on the watching crowd. Miguel moved forward, kneeling to help James. "Let me," he said quietly, collecting the fallen books and clothing. Derek watched them with barely contained frustration, fingers flexing around his baton. His authority was slipping away with each passing second, eroded by the silent presence of the man standing calmly before him. "You know," Derek said to Chuck, searching for firmer ground, "interfering with police business is a crime." Chuck met his gaze steadily. "So is abuse of power," he replied, voice low enough that only Derek and those closest could hear. Derek flinched as if struck. "You threatening me?" "Just stating facts," Chuck said, echoing James's earlier words. "Like the fact that there are about 30 people filming this right now." Derek's gaze swept the crowd, taking in the forest of phones pointed in his direction. The realization seemed to settle on him like a physical weight how this would look to his superiors, on social media, to the department, his face flushed with a volatile mixture of embarrassment and anger. "You have no idea what we deal with out here," he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear, attempting to reclaim the narrative. "The junkies. The crazies. You think you can judge from your Hollywood bubble?" Chuck didn't react to the provocation. "Not judging anyone," he said calmly. "Just suggesting there might be a better way to handle this particular situation." His measured response seemed to frustrate Derek more than any argument would have. The officer turned back to James, who had nearly finished collecting his belongings with Miguel's help. "Time's up," Derek announced, stepping forward. "I said 30 seconds. James looked up, medals now safely back in their metal case. "Almost done, officer." "Now means now," Derek insisted, the forced authority in his voice betraying his desperation to regain control of the situation. Chuck hadn't moved, but something changed in his posture, a subtle shift from observation to readiness. It wasn't anything as obvious as a fighting stance, just a redistribution of weight, a slight change in the angle of his shoulders. To most, it would have been imperceptible. To anyone trained in combat, it was unmistakable. Derek sensed it. His step faltered. He glanced at Chuck, then quickly away, like someone who'd accidentally looked directly at the sundae. "Just hurry it up," he muttered, backing down without wanting to appear as if he was. James closed his backpack and rose to his feet with military precision. He stood straight despite the weight of his possessions and years of hardship. "Thank you for your patience, officer," he said without irony or sarcasm. The simple dignity of the statement hung in the air. Several people in the crowd exchanged glances, silent conversations passing between them about what they were witnessing. Chuck's gaze never left Derek. watching him with the calm assessment of someone who had faced far more dangerous men in far more dangerous situations. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone was enough to maintain the fragile balance of the moment. Derek's radio crackled to life, breaking the tension. A dispatcher's voice called his unit number, requesting a status update. He reached for it with obvious relief, grateful for the interruption. "Unit responding," he said, turning slightly away from the confrontation. "Situation under control at 7th and Main." The lie hung obvious in the air. Nothing was under his control anymore. And everyone present knew it. As Derek spoke into his radio, Chuck took the opportunity to approach James. His movement was casual, unhurried, as if they were simply two strangers meeting on a street corner. "Marine?" Chuck asked quietly. James nodded. "Yes, sir. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines." Chuck extended his hand. "Chuck Norris. Served in the Air Force myself. Not the same kind of action you saw, I'd imagine." James took his hand with genuine respect, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Honor to meet you, sir." "The honor's mine," Chuck replied, and meant it. The simple exchange carried more weight than any dramatic confrontation could have. In that moment, with that handshake, Chuck had acknowledged what Derek had tried to diminish: the worth and dignity of the man behind the worn clothes and weathered face. Derek finished his radio call and turned back to find Chuck and James shaking hands. His expression darkened. The gesture had further undermined his authority, drawing an unspoken contrast between respect freely given and respect demanded through intimidation. "We done here?" Derek asked tersely, attempting to reclaim control of the situation. "Because there are actual crimes happening while we're standing around." Chuck turned to him calmly. "I believe we are," he said. "The gentleman has his belongings and is prepared to move on." Situation resolved. Derek bristled at Chuck's matter-of-fact tone. "I don't need civilians telling me how to do my job." "No," Chuck agreed mildly. "You don't." The simple response carried layers of meaning: acknowledgement that good police work didn't need intervention, implicit criticism that this situation had required it, and the unspoken reality that Derek's job tonight had veered far from its proper course. Derek seemed to search for a response, found none that wouldn't further damage his position, and settled for a dismissive gesture. "Clear the area," he said to James. "Don't let me find you here again." James shouldered his backpack with quiet dignity. "Understood, officer." Miguel stepped forward. "He can come with me. I'm closing up anyway, heading back to the kitchen. He can help me clean up, earn a hot meal." The offer was delivered casually, but everyone present recognized it for what it was: a small act of resistance, reclaiming James's agency and worth. Derek looked like he wanted to object but couldn't find reasonable grounds. "Whatever," he muttered. "Just clear the corner." The crowd began to disperse, though many lingered, phones still recording, unwilling to miss whatever might happen next. The confrontation had evolved into something more complex, a standoff, not of physical force but of moral authority. Chuck hadn't moved, his presence a quiet anchor in the shifting dynamics of the scene. He stood not as a celebrity or action hero, but as a witness, someone whose gaze couldn't be avoided or dismissed. Derek seemed increasingly aware of this scrutiny. He clipped his baton back onto his belt with forced casualness. "I need to get back on patrol," he announced to no one in particular. "Of course," Chuck replied evenly. "Important work." Derek couldn't tell if the comment was sincere or subtly mocking. He chose to take it at face value, grasping for any dignity he could salvage from the situation. "Stay out of trouble," he said to James with a final attempt at authority. James nodded. "Always try to, sir." Derek turned to leave, then paused. unable to resist a parting shot. "You know, not everyone with a sob story deserves special treatment," he said, loud enough for nearby onlookers to hear. "Some people are on the streets because of their own bad choices." Chuck's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a hardening. A focus that seemed to cut through Derek's bravado like a laser through paper. "True," Chuck replied, his voice calm but carrying. "Some people make bad choices, like how to use the authority they've been given." The words landed with precision. Derek's face flushed again, but he had no ready response. With a final glare, he turned and strode back toward his patrol car, shoulders rigid with wounded pride and simmering anger. As Derek retreated, the tension in the air began to dissolve. People lowered their phones, conversations resumed. The urban rhythm began to reassert itself. But something had changed, a ripple had spread through the gathered crowd, a shared recognition of what they had witnessed. Miguel approached Chuck, extending his hand. "Thank you," he said simply. "Not everyone would have stepped in." Chuck shook his hand firmly. Most would have given the chance. He glanced around at the dispersing crowd. Sometimes people just need someone to go first. James stood nearby, backpack secured, dignity intact despite everything. He offered a crisp nod to Chuck, one veteran to another, an acknowledgement deeper than words. Chuck returned the gesture with equal respect. No speeches, no dramatic declarations, just quiet recognition between men who understood the difference between true strength and its hollow imitation. As the night continued around them, Officer Derek Mills sat in his patrol car, hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly, face still flushed with humiliation. The encounter had left him shaken in ways he couldn't fully articulate. He stared through the windshield at Chuck Norris still standing on the corner, wondering how a man who had barely raised his voice, who hadn't thrown a single punch, who had made no explicit threats, had so completely dismantled his authority. The answer hovered just beyond his grasp, a lesson he wasn't yet ready to learn. Officer Derek Mills sat in his patrol car, engine idling, interior lights casting harsh shadows across his face. His fingers drummed an agitated rhythm against the steering wheel as he watched the scene through his windshield. The humiliation burned like acid in his stomach. Chuck Norris still standing there, people still filming. His authority undermined with barely a word spoken. It wasn't supposed to go this way. He was the law here. The uniform, the badge, the gun. Derek reached for his radio, then hesitated. What would he say? That he'd been stopped from roughing up a homeless vet by Chuck Norris? That wouldn't play well back at the station. His fellow officers would never let him hear the end of it. No. He needed to handle this himself. Restore his reputation. Show everyone watching that he wasn't someone to be dismissed. With sudden decision, Derek shoved the car door open and stepped back onto the sidewalk. He adjusted his belt, squared his shoulders, and strode purposefully back toward the group. On the corner, Miguel was closing his food cart, securing lids, and wiping down surfaces. James helped him, movements efficient despite his obvious weariness. Chuck stood nearby, engaged in quiet conversation with both men. The dynamic between them was relaxed, respectful. Three men simply talking as equals. The contrast with Derek's earlier approach couldn't have been more stark. "Excuse me," Derek called, voice carrying over the ambient street noise. "We're not finished here." Chuck turned unhurriedly, expression revealing nothing. The same couldn't be said for the crowd. Those who had begun to disperse now stopped, phones rising again in anticipation. "Officer," Chuck acknowledged with a slight nod. "Something else we can help you with?" The "we" wasn't lost on Derek. Chuck had aligned himself with James and Miguel, drawing a line that Derek stood outside of. It further fueled his anger. Actually, Derek said, stopping a few feet away, I've been thinking about potential charges here. He directed his words at James but kept his eyes on Chuck. Obstruction. Resisting. Maybe even assaulting an officer. James stood perfectly still, his expression composed despite the baseless accusations. Miguel's hand tightened around his cleaning rag, but he remained silent. Chuck studied Derek with the calm assessment of someone who had faced far more dangerous situations. Interesting approach, he said quietly. Especially with all these witnesses. He gestured subtly at the phone still recording. And their videos of what actually happened. Derek's jaw tightened. Video can be misleading. Doesn't show everything. Shows enough. Chuck replied simply. The two men stood facing each other, separated by only a few feet of concrete but worlds of difference in their understanding of power. Derek, who saw authority as something to be wielded and displayed. Chuck, who carried true power so comfortably he never needed to prove it. You know, Derek said, voice rising for the benefit of onlookers. I respect what you did in your movies, but this is real life, real streets, real problems. He gestured dismissively at James. You don't know this guy. Don't know what he's capable of. Chuck's expression remained unchanged. I know enough, he said. Yeah? What's that? Derek challenged. That he had the discipline not to fight back when he could have. Chuck answered. His voice was even, conversational, but it carried to everyone listening. Takes more strength to show restraint than to throw the first punch. A murmur of agreement rippled through the watching crowd. Someone called out, "Truth." Others nodded. Phones still recording every word. Derek felt the ground shifting beneath him again, his narrative being dismantled without Chuck ever raising his voice or making an aggressive move. It was maddening. He was used to controlling situations through intimidation, through the threat of force. But Chuck offered no resistance to push against. No aggression to justify escalation. Listen, Derek said, stepping closer, frustration seeping into his voice. You might be some big shot in Hollywood, but out here, I'm the authority. You don't get to waltz in and undermine an officer doing his job. Chuck regarded him steadily. Is that what you were doing? Your job? The simple question hung in the air. Several onlookers exchanged glances, the contrast between Derek's actions and true police work laid bare. Derek's face flushed. You challenging me? Just asking a question, Chuck replied mildly. Derek's hand drifted toward his belt, not to his weapon but to his baton, a movement born of frustration rather than genuine threat assessment. You need to back off, he said. This isn't your business. Chuck didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. When someone abuses their authority in public, he said calmly, it becomes everyone's business. The words struck like precision munitions, devastating in their accuracy. Derek felt his face grow hotter, his control slipping further. He had entered this confrontation expecting to reassert his dominance, to put Chuck Norris in his place. Instead, with each exchange, his position weakened. You don't know what you're talking about, Derek snapped, voice rising. You don't know what we deal with out here every day. The junkies, the crazies, the criminals. I was one of them, James interrupted quietly. All eyes turned to him. He stood straight, backpack over one shoulder, dignity intact, despite everything. Not a criminal, he clarified. But when I first came back, after losing my family, I was broken. PTSD. Couldn't hold down a job. Couldn't sleep without nightmares. Turned to the bottle. He spoke without self-pity, simply stating facts. Could have ended up on drugs too. Almost did. But I had brothers who pulled me back. Other vets who wouldn't let me fall that far. He looked directly at Derek. Not everyone gets that chance, officer. Not everyone has someone step in when they're at their lowest. The simple honesty of his words changed the air around them. Even some of those who had been enjoying the spectacle of conflict looked uncomfortable now, confronted with the humanity they had been treating as entertainment. Derek seemed momentarily at a loss, his rehearsed script of authority disrupted by genuine human experience. He recovered quickly, though, doubling down rather than reconsidering. Sad story, he said dismissively. Doesn't change the law. Doesn't change the fact that you're loitering in a business district after being told to move on. Actually, Miguel interjected, he's not loitering. He's helping me close up. He works for me now. He gestured to James, who was still holding a cleaning rag. Just hired him. The improvised employment might have been transparent to everyone present, but it created a legal shield that Derek couldn't easily brush aside. That's right, added a voice from the crowd. A woman stepped forward, well-dressed, professional, radiating confidence. And after he's done there, I'd like to speak with him about a veterans support program I'm involved with. She handed James a business card. We have transitional housing, counseling, job placement. If you're interested. James accepted the card with a surprised nod. Thank you, ma'am. The woman smiled, then turned a cooler gaze to Derek. I'm also on the Civilian Oversight Committee for the Police Department. I'd be very interested in discussing tonight's events with your commanding officer. Derek's expression froze. The situation was spiraling further beyond his control with each passing moment. What had begun as a simple assertion of authority over someone he perceived as powerless had evolved into something that could potentially threaten his career. He might have backed down then, cut his losses, but pride wounded, dangerous pride pushed him forward instead. Fine, he said tersely. He can work here, but when you're done, he pointed at James, you better be nowhere near this district. He turned to Chuck. And you should mind your own business before you find yourself in trouble. It was a weak threat, delivered without conviction, and everyone present knew it. Chuck didn't respond immediately. He studied Derek for a long moment, seeing beyond the uniform to the insecurity beneath. You know, Chuck finally said, voice low enough that Derek had to lean slightly forward to hear, I've met a lot of men with authority in my time. Military commanders, police chiefs, world leaders. He paused. The ones who actually deserved respect never had to demand it. The words hit with precision. Derek's face went rigid, jaw clenching tight enough to strain the muscles in his neck. You threatening me? He demanded, voice slightly higher than he intended. Chuck shook his head slowly, just sharing an observation. Derek's hand moved to his baton again, fingers wrapping around it as if seeking reassurance. The movement wasn't lost on Chuck, whose gaze tracked the motion without alarm. I wouldn't, he said quietly. Two simple words, delivered without emphasis. Not a threat, just advice. Derek's fingers tightened on the baton, knuckles whitening. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Every person watching held their breath, sensing the potential for things to escalate dramatically. Then, with deliberate control, Chuck shifted his weight slightly. The movement was subtle, nothing that could be construed as aggressive or threatening. Just a minor adjustment of balance, the kind of movement martial artists make when centering themselves. But to Derek, who had spent his career using physical intimidation, the message was unmistakable. Chuck Norris didn't need to make threats, didn't need to posture or boast. His confidence came from knowing exactly what he was capable of. The realization seemed to deflate Derek slightly. His hand dropped from the baton. This isn't over. he muttered, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. It could be, Chuck replied evenly. Your choice. Derek looked around at the sea of recording phones. The woman from the oversight committee. The witnesses who had seen everything. The weight of consequence settled on him not just for tonight, but potentially for his career. With a final glare that tried and failed to mask his retreat, Derek stepped back. Clear this area when you're done, he said, attempting to salvage some authority. Then he turned and walked stiffly back to his patrol car. The crowd watched him go, a few clapping softly, others murmuring among themselves. As Derek climbed into his vehicle, James turned to Chuck. You didn't have to do that, he said quietly. But thank you. Chuck nodded. The simple acknowledgement between them carrying more weight than grand speeches could have. Marines, look out for their own, he said. So do the rest of us who served. Miguel closed the last compartment on his food cart. My cousin was a Marine, he said. Fallujah, 2004. He came back different. Takes him time to trust people now. James nodded in understanding. Hard to turn it off. The vigilance. That's why what you did matters even more, Chuck said. Having the discipline not to fight back when you had every right to. He glanced toward Derek's patrol car, still idling at the curb. That's the difference between having power and knowing when not to use it. The woman with the business card approached again. I meant what I said about the program, she told James. No pressure. But the offer's genuine. We have guys who've been where you are. They help run things now. James tucked the card carefully into his pocket. I appreciate it. Might take you up on that. As the conversation continued, Derek watched from his patrol car. Engine running, but going nowhere. The scene before him, the casual respect between Chuck and James, the community forming around them, the natural authority that came from character rather than a badge, was a lesson he wasn't yet ready to learn. But the seeds had been planted, and as he finally put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, the contrast between the power he had tried to wield and the strength he had witnessed lingered in his mind like an echo he couldn't silence. Derek's patrol car circled the block once, then twice. His hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly, knuckles white against the black leather. The humiliation burned in his chest, in his throat, behind his eyes. The faces of the crowd swam in his vision, their phones recording, their expressions shifting from fear to something worse. Pity. And at the center of it all, Chuck Norris. Standing there, calm, unruffled, making him look like a fool, with barely a word spoken. Derek had joined the force 3 years ago, with clear ideas about respect, about authority, about his place in the world. The uniform, the badge, the gun they were supposed to give him what he'd never had growing up. Power. The ability to make people listen, to make them show respect. But tonight, all of that had been stripped away by a man who hadn't raised his voice, hadn't thrown a punch, hadn't even made an explicit threat. It wasn't right. It wasn't fair. The radio crackled. His sergeant's voice cut through the static. Mills. What's your 20? Derek stared at the radio for a long moment before answering. Still. At 7th and Main, he said. Handling a situation. A pause then. We're getting calls about some kind of disturbance there. Something about a celebrity? What's going on? Derek swallowed hard. Nothing I can't handle, Sarge. Just wrapping it up now. Another pause, longer this time. Make sure you do, Mills. Clean and by the book. We don't need any complications tonight. Copy that, Derek replied, setting the radio down. Clean and by the book. But it was too late for that. It had been from the moment he'd decided to make an example of James. from the moment Chuck Norris had stepped in. From the moment Derek had chosen to come back instead of driving away when he had the chance, he made a third circuit of the block, mind racing. He couldn't just leave it like this. Couldn't let them think they'd won. Couldn't face the station tomorrow with this hanging over him. The cop who got shut down by Chuck Norris. The video that would inevitably go viral. He needed to finish this. On his terms. Back at the corner, the scene had evolved. Miguel's food cart was now closed, utensils cleaned, and surfaces wiped down. James had helped him pack everything away, working with the efficient precision of someone accustomed to maintaining equipment. Chuck stood nearby, engaged in conversation with both men and the woman who had offered James the veterans program information. Most of the crowd had dispersed, though a few lingerers remained, some still recording, others simply watching the aftermath of the confrontation. The energy had shifted from tense anticipation to something almost communal, strangers connected by their shared witness to something meaningful. Derek pulled his patrol car to the curb once more, lights flashing but sirens silent. He stepped out with deliberate authority, adjusting his belt, squaring his shoulders. This time would be different. This time he would regain control. "Thought I told you to clear the area," he called, striding toward the group. All eyes turned to him. The conversation stopped. The relaxed atmosphere tensed again, like a wire pulled taut. Chuck turned unhurriedly, his expression revealing nothing but calm assessment. "We were just finishing up," he said. "Well, finish faster," Derek snapped. He gestured at the remaining onlookers. "This isn't a social gathering. It's a public thoroughfare." Miguel had begun pushing his cart toward a nearby alley where his truck was parked. "We're going," he said. "No trouble." Derek ignored him, focusing on James instead. I told you to clear out of this district." James stood his ground, backpack over his shoulder. "I'm helping Miguel load his equipment, officer. Then I'll be on my way." "On your way where exactly?" Derek pressed, voice sharp. "Another doorway? Another street corner? You think I don't know what happens as soon as I drive away?" The woman from the oversight committee stepped forward. "Actually, Mr. Connor will be coming with me to discuss the veterans program I mentioned. We have overnight accommodations available." Derek's eyes narrowed. Convenient timing. Sometimes, good timing is all someone needs, she replied evenly. Chuck had remained silent, watching the exchange with the careful assessment of someone who understood conflict resolution far better than Derek ever could. He stood slightly to the side, not inserting himself but clearly prepared if needed. Derek sensed it, the readiness beneath Chuck's calm exterior. It fueled his frustration, his need to reassert control over a situation that had slipped entirely from his grasp. "You know what?" Derek said, turning to Chuck. "I'm getting tired of civilians interfering with police business. And I'm getting tired of watching you harass this man," Chuck replied, voice still calm, but carrying a new firmness. "He's done nothing wrong. He's a veteran who served his country. He deserves better than this." Derek stepped closer, entering Chuck's personal space. "You don't get to decide that. I'm the law here." "The law," Chuck repeated quietly. "Not justice." The distinction hung in the air between them. Derek's face flushed deeper, the last threads of his professional control fraying dangerously. "Step back," he ordered, hand moving to his baton. Chuck didn't move. "Why? Am I threatening you in some way?" The simple question highlighted the absurdity of the situation. Derek, armed with gun, baton, taser, and the full authority of his badge, claiming to feel threatened by a man who stood perfectly still, hands at his sides. "I said, step back," Derek repeated, unclipping his baton and extending it with a metallic snap. A collective intake of breath from the onlookers. Phones raised higher. The woman from the oversight committee spoke urgently into her own phone, describing the situation to someone on the other end. James moved forward, placing himself between Derek and Chuck. "Officer," he said calmly, "there's no need for this. We're leaving peacefully. Get out of the way," Derek ordered, gesturing with the baton. "No, sir," James replied quietly. "I don't think I will." The simple refusal, delivered without aggression, without disrespect, but with absolute firmness, seemed to push Derek over some internal edge. His face contorted, frustration and wounded pride overriding training and judgment. "That's it," he snarled. "On the ground. Now. Both of you." Neither man moved. They stood side by side now. Chuck and James. Different in so many ways, but united in this moment by a shared understanding of when to stand firm. "Officer Mills." The sharp call came from down the street. Derek turned to see his sergeant approaching rapidly, face set in a hard mask of professional concern. Behind him, 2 more patrol cars pulled to the curb, lights flashing. "Stand down, Mills," the sergeant ordered, closing the distance. "What the hell is going on here?" Derek's grip on the baton tightened. "Handling a disturbance, Sarge." These individuals were resisting lawful orders to disperse. The sergeant took in the scene with one quick sweep: the closed food cart, James with his backpack, the small crowd with their recording phones, and Chuck Norris standing calmly amid it all. "Doesn't look like much of a disturbance to me," he observed dryly. He nodded respectfully to Chuck. "Mr. Norris, unusual to see you in our district." "Just passing through," Chuck replied. "Witnessed something I thought needed attention." The sergeant's expression tightened. He turned back to Derek. "We'll discuss this back at the station. For now, return to your vehicle." "But Sarge," Derek began. "That's an order, Mills." The sergeant cut him off. "Now." Derek stood frozen for a moment, baton still in hand, face flushed with anger and embarrassment. The situation had slipped completely beyond his control, his authority stripped away in front of the very people he'd been trying to impress with it. In that moment, something broke inside him. Not his pride that had been wounded but remained intact. What broke was the thin veneer of professional restraint, the last tether holding back his raw frustration. "You know what?" he said, voice rising. "No. I'm tired of this. Tired of these people thinking they can disrespect an officer and get away with it." The sergeant's expression hardened. "Mills, stand down. That's a direct order." But Derek was beyond orders now. He turned back to James, baton raised. "On the ground. Last warning." The moment hung suspended in time, Derek with his baton raised, James standing firm but non-aggressive, Chuck watching with calm readiness, the sergeant moving forward with alarm evident on his face, onlookers frozen in anticipation of what might happen next. Then Derek lunged forward, swinging the baton in a short, vicious arc, aimed at James's shoulder. What happened next occurred so quickly that many of the onlookers would later debate exactly what they'd seen, reviewing their videos frame by frame in slow motion. Chuck moved. Not dramatically. Not with any flashy technique from his action films. Just a simple, efficient interception, stepping slightly forward, his arm rising to block Derek's strike with textbook precision. The baton connected with Chuck's forearm instead of James's shoulder, the impact making a solid sound that carried across the now silent street corner. Derek's eyes widened in shock. He hadn't expected the block, hadn't adjusted his balance for the interrupted momentum. He stumbled slightly, off balance, baton still gripped tightly. Chuck didn't counterattack, didn't strike, didn't throw Derek to the ground. as he easily could have. He simply maintained the block, creating a barrier between the baton and James. "That's enough," Chuck said quietly. Derek stared at him, shock giving way to renewed anger. He pulled the baton back, readying for another swing. Before he could complete the motion, the sergeant was there, gripping his arm firmly. "Mills, stand down." But Derek was beyond reason now. He tried to shake off the sergeant's grip, eyes still locked on Chuck. "Get off me, Officer Mills," the sergeant said, voice sharp with command. "You are suspended. Effective immediately. Hand over your badge and weapon. Now." The words seemed to penetrate Derek's fog of anger. He froze, baton still raised, the reality of what he'd done, what he'd been about to do, finally breaking through his rage. "Sarge," he began, voice suddenly uncertain. "I was just—" "Save it," the sergeant cut him off. "Badge and gun. Now." The street corner had gone completely silent. Even the ambient city noise seemed muted, as if the urban environment itself were holding its breath. Every person present understood they were witnessing something profoundly significant, not just the end of a confrontation, but possibly the end of a career. Derek lowered the baton slowly, the fight draining out of him like air from a punctured tire. With mechanical movements, he unclipped his badge, then his service weapon, handing both to the sergeant. "Report to Internal Affairs at 800 tomorrow," the sergeant said, voice tight with controlled anger. "There will be a full investigation." Derek nodded numbly. All arrogance stripped away, leaving only a young man facing consequences he had never anticipated when his shift began. The sergeant turned to Chuck and James. "I apologize for this incident," he said formally. "We'll take appropriate action." Chuck nodded once, acknowledgement rather than acceptance. "I know you will," he said. "But it's not me who deserves the apology." The sergeant glanced at James, understanding immediately. "Mr. Connor, on behalf of the department, I apologize for Officer Mills's conduct. It doesn't reflect our values or training." James straightened slightly, military bearing evident despite his worn clothing. "Thank you, Sergeant," he said simply. Another officer approached, leading Derek toward one of the patrol cars not as a criminal, but as a fellow officer who had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. As Derek was led away, he glanced back once. His eyes met Chuck's across the distance. Anger still there, but something else too. A glimmer of recognition, perhaps. Understanding that he had been defeated not by superior force, but by superior discipline. Chuck held his gaze steadily, without triumph or mockery. Just the calm assessment of a man who understood the difference between power and strength. The moment passed. Derek turned away, shoulders slumped, and climbed into the patrol car. The sergeant approached Chuck again. "We'll need statements from all of you," he said. "Of course," Chuck replied. As the formal procedures began, officers taking witness statements, the crowd finally dispersing. The immediate drama giving way to the bureaucracy that would follow. James turned to Chuck. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Not just for stopping him, for seeing me as a person, not a problem." Chuck nodded, understanding exactly what James meant. "Marines look out for their own," he said again. "So do the rest of us who served." The woman from the oversight committee joined them. "The offer still stands," she told James. "No pressure. But there's a place for you tonight if you want it. And maybe something more permanent after that." James considered for a moment, then nodded. "I think I'm ready," he said. "Been on my own long enough." As they spoke, Miguel finished securing his cart to his truck. He approached the group, wiping his hands on a rag. "My offer stands too," he said to James. "Need help in the kitchen, 3 days a week." Pays not much, but it's honest work. James smiled, a small expression, but genuine. I'd like that, he said. Thank you. Chuck watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. No grand speeches. No dramatic declarations. Just small acts of decency, creating ripples that might, in time, change a life. The sergeant returned with forms for them to sign. As Chuck completed his statement, he glanced toward the patrol car where Derek sat, staring straight ahead, future uncertain. What will happen to him? Chuck asked quietly. The sergeant sighed. Investigation. Probably desk duty at best. Termination at worst. Depends on his record, the review board, and how this plays out in the media. He nodded toward the phones that had recorded everything. And it will play out in the media. Chuck nodded thoughtfully. He made bad choices tonight, he said, but maybe he can learn from them. Maybe, the sergeant agreed, though his tone suggested skepticism. Some do, some don't. As the official business concluded, the street corner began returning to normal. Traffic flowed past. Pedestrians went about their evening. The urban rhythm reasserted itself, absorbing the night's events like a stone dropped into water ripples spreading outward, then gradually fading. But for those who had been part of it, something had changed. Something important had been witnessed, a lesson about power, about respect, about the difference between demanding authority and commanding it naturally. As Chuck prepared to leave, James offered his hand one final time. Honor meeting you, sir, he said. Chuck shook it firmly. The honor was mine, he replied, and meant it. Morning light crept across the city, turning glass towers into pillars of fire and shadow. The downtown streets had a different energy now, delivery trucks rumbling between buildings, early commuters clutching coffee cups, street cleaners washing away the previous night's revelry. The urban cycle continued, as it always did, indifferent to individual dramas. At the corner of 7th and Main, Miguel's taco cart was already open, steam rising from the griddle as he prepared for the breakfast rush. His hands moved with the same unhurried precision, the same careful attention to detail. But something had changed since yesterday, a new lightness in his movements, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Beside him stood James, wearing a clean shirt and jeans that Miguel's wife had insisted on giving him. He worked the second griddle, flipping eggs with the focused concentration of someone determined to do even the simplest task well. Not bad, Miguel commented, nodding at the perfectly cooked eggs. You've done this before. James nodded. Mess duty. Third tour. Our regular cook got hit by an IED. I filled in for 3 months. Miguel accepted this with a simple nod. No prying questions, no uncomfortable sympathy. Just acknowledgement of a shared reality. Military trained my cousin too well, he said, slicing avocados with practiced efficiency. Guy can't even go to a restaurant without scanning for exits, checking sight lines. James's mouth quirked slightly. Hard to turn off, he agreed. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the rhythm of the kitchen creating its own form of meditation. James seemed to relax into it, shoulders loosening, movements becoming more fluid. Saw you got some new clothes, Miguel observed casually. James nodded. Miss Kaplan, the lady from last night, took me to the Veterans Center. They have a whole closet of donations. Clean shower, too. You staying there? For now, James replied. They have transitional housing, counseling, job placement. He flipped another egg, said I can work in their kitchen when I'm not here with you. Miguel smiled. Good. Between the two of us, we'll keep you too busy to get in trouble with any more cops. The light joke hung in the air between them, acknowledging what had happened without dwelling on it. James smiled slightly, a small expression, but genuine. Across town, at the downtown police precinct, Sergeant Martinez sat opposite Officer Derek Mills in a small interview room. Neither man looked like they'd slept much. Derek's uniform was gone, replaced by civilian clothes that somehow made him look younger, more vulnerable. His eyes were red-rimmed, his posture a mixture of defensiveness and defeat. "The review board meets next week," Martinez said, sliding a folder across the table. "Everything's in here: witness statements, body cam footage, civilian videos." "It doesn't look good, Mills." Derek stared at the folder without opening it. "Am I fired?" Martinez sighed heavily. "That's not my call. But I won't sugarcoat it. You assaulted a civilian with your baton. On video. With Chuck Norris as a witness." He shook his head. "It's about as bad as it gets." Derek's jaw tightened. "He interfered with—" "Don't!" Martinez cut him off sharply. "Don't start with that. I've watched the videos, Mills. All of them. You weren't doing your job. You were bullying a homeless vet. Because you could. Because it made you feel big." Derek flinched as if struck. "That's not—" "It is," Martinez insisted. "And you know it." He leaned forward, voice lowering. "Why did you join the force, Mills? Really? Not the answer you gave in the academy. The real reason." Derek looked away, silent, for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its usual hardness. "Wanted respect," he admitted quietly. "Grew up with nothing. No money. No name. Nobody listened to me. Nobody saw me." His fingers traced invisible patterns on the table. "Thought the badge would change that." Martinez nodded slowly. "It does change things," he agreed. "Gives you authority. But respect?" He shook his head. "That's different. Has to be earned." "I know that," Derek muttered. "Do you?" Martinez challenged. "Because last night wasn't about earning respect. It was about demanding it. Forcing it. And when that didn't work, you escalated. Against an old homeless vet who wasn't threatening anyone." Derek had no answer to that. He stared at his hands, the reality of his actions settling on him like a physical weight. "Here's what I don't understand," Martinez continued after a moment. "You've got decent marks in most areas. No excessive force complaints before this. What happened last night? Why that man? Why that moment?" Derek was silent for so long that Martinez thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "He didn't seem afraid of me." The simple admission hung in the air between them. Martinez studied the younger officer's face, seeing beyond the arrogance to the insecurity beneath. "And that bothered you?" Martinez stated rather than asked. That he wasn't intimidated by the uniform. Derek nodded reluctantly. "Everyone else moves when I tell them to. Steps back. Looks down. Shows respect." His voice hardened slightly. "He just stood there. Like I was nothing." Martinez leaned back, understanding dawning in his eyes. "So you escalated. To prove you weren't nothing." Derek had no response to that. The truth of it was too raw, too close to the surface. Martinez sighed heavily. "Mills, respect isn't the same as fear. What you were demanding wasn't respect, it was submission." He tapped the folder. "And when you didn't get it, you were willing to hurt someone to prove a point." "I know I screwed up," Derek admitted, a hint of his old defensiveness creeping back. "But it's not like I'm the only one. You know how it is out there. The streets. The people who don't listen." "Stop." Martinez cut him off again. "Just stop. This isn't about the streets or the job. This is about you, your choices. He leaned forward, eyes locking with Derek's. And until you understand that, nothing changes. Meanwhile, at the Veterans Center, James sat in a small but clean room, his first private space in almost 2 years. The bed was neatly made, military corners out of habit. His few possessions were arranged with precision on the small desk. The metal box containing his medals sat open, the decorations gleaming in the morning light. A knock came at the door. "Group session in 15 minutes, called a friendly voice. "Coffee and donuts in the common room." "Be right there," James replied. He picked up the photo of his family, his wife's smile, his daughter's eyes so like his own, and gently placed it beside the medals. For the first time in a long while, he let himself really look at them, really remember, without the usual rush of pain forcing him to turn away. "Miss you both," he said quietly. "But I think maybe I'm finding my way back." He closed the metal box carefully, tucked the photo into his shirt pocket close to his heart, and stepped out into the hallway. Other veterans nodded to him as he passed, some clearly still struggling with their own battles, others further along the path to healing, all sharing an unspoken understanding of what it meant to serve, to suffer, to try to find a way forward. In the common room, a television played footage from the previous night, Chuck Norris standing calm and unmovable as Officer Mills faced him down. Several veterans had gathered to watch, their expressions a mixture of satisfaction and knowing recognition. "Man, that cop had no idea who he was messing with," one commented. "Not just physically," added another, older veteran. "Norris served too. Air Force. He gets it." James watched silently, seeing the confrontation from this new perspective, not just as the subject of it, but as one moment in a larger story about power, respect, and what it truly means to serve. The center's director, a former Army captain who had lost a leg in Iraq, wheeled over to stand beside James. "Quite a night," she observed. "You okay?" James nodded slowly. "Getting there," he said. "First time in a while I've felt." He searched for the right word. "Visible." She nodded, in understanding. "That's how it starts," she said. "Being seen. Then remembering how to see yourself." In a quiet coffee shop several blocks away, Chuck Norris sat with Miss Kaplan from the Oversight Committee, reviewing her notes from the previous night's incident. "The department will conduct a full investigation," she was saying. "With all the video evidence, plus witness statements, I don't see how Officer Mills keeps his badge." Chuck sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Maybe that's not the only possible outcome," he said. She looked up in surprise. "You think he should keep his job? After what he did?" "I think," Chuck replied carefully, "that sometimes people deserve a chance to learn from their mistakes, if they're willing to. That's surprisingly forgiving, given what happened." Chuck shrugged slightly. "I've seen a lot of conflicts in my time. Some people fight because they're cruel, others fight because they're afraid." He set his cup down. That officer, he was scared. Not of physical danger, but of losing control, losing authority. It came from insecurity, not malice. "Still dangerous," she pointed out. "Absolutely," Chuck agreed. "And there should be consequences. But maybe also a path to becoming better. Not just punishment." As he left the coffee shop, Chuck walked along the same downtown streets that had witnessed the previous night's confrontation. At the corner of 7th and Main, he paused. Miguel's taco cart was doing brisk business, a line of customers waiting patiently. James worked alongside Miguel, serving food with the same disciplined focus he had likely once applied to military operations. Chuck didn't approach, didn't call attention to himself. He simply watched for a moment, noting the straight line of James's shoulders, the purpose in his movements, the small but genuine smile as he handed a customer their order. James happened to look up, his gaze meeting Chuck's across the busy sidewalk. Recognition flashed in his eyes. He straightened slightly, offering a crisp nod, not subservience, but respect freely given between equals. Chuck returned the gesture with the same dignity, then continued on his way, blending back into the urban flow. No dramatic goodbyes. No inspirational speeches. Just quiet acknowledgement between men who understood that true strength lay not in dominating others, but in standing firm when it mattered most. As Chuck walked away, his presence lingered in the lives he had touched. James finding his way back from the darkness, Miguel standing up for what was right despite the risk, Officer Derek Mills facing a reckoning with his understanding of authority, and countless witnesses carrying the memory of what they had seen. Small ripples spreading outward, changing the pattern of the waters they passed through, continuing long after their source had moved on. Because that is the nature of true influence, not demanding respect through fear or intimidation, but earning it through character and action, not forcing others to bend, but showing them, through quiet example, how to stand tall. And sometimes, in the space between chaos and resolution, all it takes is one person willing to step forward, to stand unmoving in the face of injustice, to remind us all of what courage really looks like. Not in flying fists or shouted threats, but in the calm certainty that right is right, even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult. In the end, that was the lesson that lingered long after the night had passed into memory. True strength needs no audience. True respect cannot be demanded. And true courage often speaks most loudly in moments of perfect, disciplined silence. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.